Hi, this is Andrea Kane, and I'm here with you for HIT 445. We are still on week 6, week 6, and we are covering chapters 11, 16, and 20. This is the middle lecture video on chapter 16. We're going to focus on navigating the accreditation, certification, or licensure processes. And of course, we're still covering unit objectives 9.7.1 through 9.7.16. as well as 9.2.2. Okay, so our learning objectives according to the book are to explain the performance improvement perspectives of accreditation, certification, and licensure organizations. Distinguish the various approaches of accreditation, certification, and licensure agencies to the site visit and survey. Identify approaches that lead to success in the survey process. And they want us to start by talking about what are the differences between accreditation, licensure, and certification. Accreditation is the act of granting approval to a healthcare organization. It is typically done by an organization that has a contract with the federal government for doing these surveys. Licensure is the act of granting a healthcare organization or an individual healthcare provider permission to provide services of a defined scope in a limited geographic area, typically done by a state. Certification grants approval for a healthcare organization to provide services to a specific group of beneficiaries. There are compulsory reviews and there are voluntary reviews. Compulsory reviews are typically performed to fulfill legal or licensure requirements. Voluntary reviews are usually conducted at the request of the healthcare facility who is seeking accreditation. So for instance, a review by the state or the Fed would be a compulsory review. A voluntary review would be accreditation by Joint Commission or CARF or another organization. So we've studied some of these bodies, accrediting bodies. The Joint Commission is the oldest and most well known. Then you have DNV-GL, Healthcare Accreditation. They're the newest kid on the block, and they are much less expensive than Joint Commission. Then you have Commission on Accreditation of Rehab Facilities, and when they say rehab, it's so much more than just plain rehab, and that's CARF. They also do all sorts of settings. I was involved with a CARF survey for a retirement center that had all the way up to a skilled nursing unit service provided. Then you have the American Osteopathic Association, who is also an accreditation body. I believe that they're actually even older than Joint Commission, but they are lesser known. You have NCQA that we've studied throughout your time, and that's the National Committee for Quality Assurance. They come up with HEDIS measures, and they're really looking more at physician practices and managed care companies, insurances, different things like that. Then you've got Accreditation Association for Ambulatory Healthcare, AAAHC. You have CMS conditions of participation. These are regulations, not so much a body, but they're regulations. So make sure you understand that CMS conditions of participation, that is not a body. Those are federal regulations that have to be followed. Then state licensure, and that's specific to the state. Healthcare organizations and healthcare providers have to meet multiple standards and regulations. They need to continuously review organization operating policies and procedures to make sure they reflect the changes going on with accreditation standards and federal and state regulations, because they do change over time. And sometimes they just kind of sneak in there, and you have to make sure every year you go in and check. And when it comes to Joint Commission, sometimes they change things more often than every year. The most stringent standard or regulation on each aspect of care is the one that needs to be identified, and your policies and procedures need to be based on that standard or regulation. How do you survive the survey process? Well, having been through, I don't know if I had to add them up, would it be 15 maybe? Maybe more. Probably more if I added it all up. Excuse me, but you prepare for them not a few weeks or a few months before they're due to be reviewed. If you really care about your patients, you will have the mantra, every patient, every time. You will want to make it a part of your everyday activities. You live it, you breathe it, you do it every patient, every time. So beyond that, you need a solid accreditation licensure infrastructure that's built and maintained so the organization is always ready, continuously ready for an inspection at any time. Some surveys can be scheduled. Most of them are unannounced. Most are unannounced these days. CMS accepts accreditation by organizations with deeming authority in granting what it calls deemed status. And that's like Joint Commission, AOA, DNV, those are all, and CARF, those are all organizations that the federal government has given deeming authority. So they conduct surveys on behalf of the federal government. Surveyors want to be assured that the facility's leadership and staff can successfully execute organizational policies and procedures and are continuously monitoring and improving performance in the organization, and that those improvements are tied to the organization's strategic plan. There is really not one standard review process, although they are almost all very similar. Some voluntary processes are more flexible and tailored to the organization. Governmental practices or processes tend to be more bureaucratic, but I would tell you that they all pretty much follow the same process, depending on whether they're there on a complaint or whether they're there for a survey type situation. So it talks about Joint Commission first, that they have unannounced surveys. The surveys have a basic knowledge of the organization because you have to fill out an application way far, months in advance. And you have to keep up your information in the Joint Commission's software on an annual basis. So at any given time, any of the Joint Commission surveyors could go in and look at your facility. They could see all your services, all your locations, current information about customer satisfaction, infection rate, all these basic things. They're all there. They also have access to consumer complaints, prior accreditation data. So for instance, if you've been accredited by Joint Commission for the last 25 or 30 years, all that data is available to them. And then core measures. That's kind of like your infection information, but it's also the standard of care type information. You think of VTE after hip or knee replacement. That's kind of core measure. I should say preventing VTEs after, and that's venous thrombolytic embolism. So the survey team, the composition of it varies depending on the size of the organization. The smaller the organization, the more likely you are to have 3 or maybe 4 surveyors. The bigger you are, you can have, I've been in surveys where we've had 10 surveyors. So it just depends. You will always have a physician, and you will always have someone who's either an administrator or a nurse. Then the other person that they bring in is facilities to do the whole entire facilities walkthrough. That's your expert in environment of care and life safety issues. But most survey teams are 1 physician, 1 administrator, 1 RN, and then you have your environment of care, life safety issues expert that comes in. Most Joint Commission surveys last 3.5 days. Sometimes if the bigger the facility, the longer it will last. The longest survey that I was involved in lasted, was it 8 days or 9 days? But then again, we had multiple sites, multiple organizations, and we were very, very large. but that was the longest one I'd ever been involved with. Opening conference, they limit who goes to the opening conference. If you're in HIM, odds are you're not going to be involved. They typically tap quality management, senior leadership, some high-level nursing individuals, that type of thing for the opening conference. They have a basic schedule of activities, and before you're due for your survey, they will run through some of that, or they'll provide organizations that are due to have a survey in the next 3 to 6 months and a sample schedule of activities. But once they come on site for that opening conference, essentially they will set that up. They will start arranging for where they want to go, when do they want to go there. So for instance, if it's a hospital that has some physician practices, when they're doing the opening conference, they'll ask for a list of the physician practices and they'll make up their mind, oh, we're going to do this the afternoon of day 2. Or if they want to go to the OR, we'll do that morning of day 2. Or if you have a behavioral health unit, they may choose to do that the afternoon of the day 1. It just depends. They'll probably go to ICU in the afternoon of day 1. They make all of that out. And they identify who they want to interview. So for instance, HR, medical staff services, they may choose HIM, but these days they usually don't. They usually want medical staff. HIM is included in some of the group interviews about handling information, IT, and record of care treatment services, that type of thing that involves nursing, IT, HIM, and a few others. Those are group interviews. But if there are specific individuals, they'll identify them. For instance, if they want to talk to the medical director of the behavioral health unit, they'll identify that. If they want to talk to the chief of staff or the president of the medical staff, they'll make arrangements for that. Those are some of the individuals that they might ask for. Leaders are expected at that point to provide an overview of the organization's mission, vision, strategic goals, objectives, current experiences, outcomes, performance monitoring, and improvement activities. And that's typically prepared ahead of time and ready to go. So for instance, before your 3 to 6 month window opens for your facility to be surveyed, typically that's created, and then it might have a few tweaks right before it's provided, but that has to be ready to go. And before you even get to the opening conference, the day that the Joint Commission is going to be on site, every day that they're going to be on site, at 7 o'clock in the morning, they open up their website. And typically there's 3 or 4 individuals in each organization that have access to the Joint Commission website, and it's their job to go in. They take turns, and it's somebody's job to go in every morning at 7 a.m. or 7:05 or 7:10 in the morning and look to see if the Joint Commission is coming on site, because they will put it there on their website. And if they are, they'll tell you who is coming, and you'll know for sure they're going to be on site by 8:30 in the morning, and here's who's coming and whether they're a nurse, an administrator, a physician, or facilities. And that way you can then start alerting people they're coming today, and that helps. Or you go in, you see that there's nobody slated to come to your facility for the day, so you can breathe a sigh of relief that maybe it'll be tomorrow that they'll come. But anyway, I've had access to Joint Commission to do that before, and it's fairly easy to go in and do. You just go in and sign into Joint Commission and all of that. In my last position in quality management for a small health system here in Iowa, I had administrator access to the Joint Commission website for the organization, and could go in and make sure that others had access if they needed it, and submit information and update information. So that's part of how I know all of that, plus having been involved in so many surveys over the years. They tailor their on-site activities based on your midpoint self-assessment action plan, because midway in your cycle, you have to do a self-assessment action plan on all of the regulations, the Joint Commission items. And then they also look at your previous accreditation data. Where did you have problems? What did you get cited for on the last accreditation cycle and had to fix? Then they also look for any consumer complaints reported. And when Joint Commission comes, you have to post signs that alert people to your facility that Joint Commission is there and on site, and if they have complaints, how they can report those to the Joint Commission surveyors while they're there on site. So there's a lot that goes into all of this. They visit patient care settings, conduct interviews with selected patients, department and program staff, and the organization's leaders. They verify the status of the organization and just try and see, are you living up to the things you're supposed to be living up to, or are you not? They explore trigger issues like medication administration and conduct tracer activities. Trigger issues mean that they'll probably choose an RN on a particular unit, and they'll want to watch a med pass, and they'll want to watch how that nurse obtains the medications, verifies them, sets them up, and actually gives them to the patient. And they'll want to see, does the nurse educate the patient, go over, answer any questions with the patient, make sure that the patient actually takes the drugs and they don't get dropped into the bed or down somebody's sleeve or misplaced or that sort of thing, and how it gets documented. All of that. And if they use barcoding, how they scan the wristband, how they make sure that they're using 2 patient identifiers and following national patient safety goals and all of that. Tracer activities are where they go up to the unit and they will trace a patient. They will essentially find a patient and they will go back and follow it. So for instance, they may take a patient that is on a med-surg unit, and if the patient came through the ED, they'll go back down to the ED and they'll take a look around the ED, ask questions. Then they'll follow where the patient's back up on the floor. They'll talk to the patient. They'll talk to the healthcare provider, whether it's an NP, PA, or a physician. They'll talk to the nurse that's providing the patient's care. They may talk to the aide. If the housekeeper comes in or somebody from food services is dropping off a tray, they may interact with them. Another way they may do it is by tracing with the OR. They may look at a patient on that med-surg unit, who had surgery a day or 2 ago and go back down to surgery, look around, ask questions, and then follow the patient back up. With the OR, they also watch procedures. They actually gown up, glove up, and they go into the OR to make sure that timeouts are being done properly. And they look around and make sure that people are behaving the way that they should and that they're following their own protocols, their policies and procedures and all those types of things. They do some closed record review where these days they sit down with a laptop and with somebody from nursing informatics and they go through patient charts online in the EHR. They may look at patients that were in the ED 3 or 4 days ago. They may look at a patient that was in the ED last night. They may look at someone who was discharged a month ago. It just depends on what they want to do. They do conduct some leadership interviews with top administration, medical staff officials, but for the most part, they want to talk with frontline staff. They will talk with department heads, but again, they're really focused on talking with frontline staff, like nurses, aides, pharmacy techs who may be doing medication reconciliation, all those types of things. And the same thing with the facilities person. They may tour around with the director of facilities, but they're also asking plan ops staff questions as they go through things. So they look at system tracers, they do medication management, data management, infection control. They sometimes do a system tracer with a group of people, sort of like a tabletop exercise, or they may actually sit down and go through with 1 or 2 people. Then they develop a preliminary report of the on-site survey noting any deficiencies. This typically happens on the morning of day 3. if they're only there for 3 days. Otherwise, it'll happen on the morning of day 4 or morning of day 5, depending on how it works. Then they will conduct an exit conference. They'll summarize their findings, explain any deficiencies, and report what they're probably going to recommend to the central office in terms of accreditation. They will not tell you whether or not you're going to be accredited, but they pretty much tell you these are the findings, these are your deficiencies, and they leave it up to you to kind of figure out whether or not you're on the edge. Very few organizations get through without some deficiencies, and typically it's not surprising when organizations have multiple deficiencies. But what you want to do is make sure they're not showstopper deliveries, that they're not the ones that are so extreme that they basically put you on notice and say that if you don't have this fixed in 30 days, they're shutting you down or taking your accreditation away. But anyway, again, the closing exit conference, they call it exit conference. When they do this, it's typically senior leadership, quality management, and a handful of other people. It is not open to just anybody in general. Neither was the opening conference. The exit isn't either. Organizations tend to keep this information very close to their vest. They don't usually announce it until they have the report back, so they know what they need to be doing for sure. Sometimes they will disagree with the surveyor about some of the surveyor's findings or the deficiencies that they've laid on the organization. During the survey process, they can question that and try and provide evidence to sway the surveyor to realize that there wasn't a deficiency there. Sometimes that's successful, sometimes it's not. Then we move on to certification and licensure. Now we're talking specifically about long-term care facilities. These are almost always unscheduled, almost always. I would say I can't remember the last time that we had a nursing home that I was involved with that didn't have an unscheduled review. They'll come in for complaints, they'll come in for their surveys. They typically have at least one surveyor, and on complaints, they have one surveyor. If it's a survey and not a complaint, they will have 2 to 3 who come in. One will be from nursing, and then you'll have one that's got some other background, either pharmacy, dietetic, or clinical lab. They will look for evidence of trigger issues like patients suffering from dehydration, pressure ulcers, fecal impaction. And they get the information about how your facility is doing from your facility's quality indicator profile, which comes off MDS information that has to be sent in on a regular basis. You have to put a public notice of the survey on the door of the facility and all nursing stations. Joint Commission just requires that you have it on your doors. Examination of facility operations, they look at your resident council, who's on there. They try and interview some of those members. They will interview or visit ancillary departments, definitely the nursing units, and they will review resident records. They will have a closed meeting with administrators and the DON to summarize their findings. CARF. CARF takes care of a lot of different facility types, not just rehab. They also do behavioral health. They also do retirement living centers and all sorts of things like that. They do typically have 3 surveyors, maybe 4, depending on how big the facility is and how many days they're going to be there. It is a more flexible survey process than Joint Commission or the state. The state is the most rigid, but Joint Commission is not that far behind the state in their rigidity. Joint Commission likes their own way on things, and the state demands their way on things. But anyway, CARF, they try and tailor it to patient care services, the community of interest of the organization. They do an opening conference, been through that before, and they are much more open about having anybody and everybody there at their opening conference. When it's the state and it's Joint Commission, they are much more closed. They only want certain individuals there, and the facilities tend to be a lot more territorial about that, keeping out anyone who isn't in the, quote, inner circle. But with CARF surveys, it's a lot more open because CARF really wants to see how everyone's being involved. Is everyone cooperative? Are they really trying to work together? They look for that. They do a document review, just like Joint Commission and the state do. They interview program staff and patients. They also have an exit interview. And again, the exit interview is a lot more open. It is with the organization's leaders, but sometimes they do allow others in. And they'll identify deficiencies and present an overall summary of findings. Conditions of participation. These are often they used to be called HCFA validation audits. Now they're called COP unannounced surveys. And what they are is there's a certain percentage of accreditation surveys that the federal government wants to validate that Joint Commission and AOA and DNV and those others have done what they're supposed to do. So they randomly, or maybe not so randomly, but they choose facilities that have been surveyed within the last 3 months, and they pick some and they send the state Department of Health in there, although they can have some CMS officials that come, but they will come in and they will do a whole nother survey on top. So you just finished with your Joint Commission survey, and a month later you can have the state there. It's not that you did anything wrong, they're just doing that COP validation survey. They're coming in and making sure that Joint Commission did their job properly, and so they survey. However, the COP validation surveys are much more intense than the Joint Commission surveys. But the process is very similar. It's essentially like when you open a new facility and the state comes in to license. And it is exactly like that. It's as if you opened your doors and now the state's coming in to license you. That's the COP validation survey. All right, well, that is it for Chapter 16. I'm sorry I didn't even tell you to open to page 329. If you have any questions, let me know. Hopefully all is well with you, and I look forward to coming back and talking to you briefly about Chapter 20, and that will end for week 6. Take care.